Well, my voice is back in action, so I've decided to make some videos and get back into action after spring break. And today we're going to be talking about the nervous system. And first of all, we're going to talk about the several different ways in which the nervous system is categorized. So the first way is the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord and is the colored part of this diagram. The peripheral nervous system is all parts of the nervous system that are not part of the central nervous system, and it's colored red here. And it includes any peripheral nerves as well as ganglia. Now, when we look at the peripheral nervous system versus the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, as I said, is made up of nerves and ganglia. And a nerve is a bundle of neuronal axons, that is, neuron cell axons. And we'll be talking about what axons are in just a minute. But these neurons and their axons, they're outside the central nervous system, and these are bundled together and they make up what we call a nerve. A ganglion, or a ganglia, is a bundle or a collection of neuron cell bodies that is outside the central nervous system. So the axons from these neuron cell bodies is what makes up the peripheral nerves. We can also divide up the central nervous system in terms of whether the nerves are in the central nervous system or the nerves are outside the central nervous system or originate from the spinal cord. And spinal nerves, which are shown here in blue, are nerves that originate in the spinal cord. And they're also shown on the left of this diagram. The other type of nerves are called cranial nerves, and cranial nerves are nerves that originate in the brain. And they're on the right of this diagram, excluding the ones down near the bottom of the spinal cord. The rest of the nerves that are shown on the right here are different cranial nerves that come out of starting in the medulla, going up through the pons and other parts of the brainstem. Now, another way to look at the nervous system is the afferent versus the efferent parts of the nervous system. The afferent neurons are neurons that transmit action potentials from the sensory organs to the central nervous system. So they're shown here in number 1 here is the receptor organ or the sensory organ. Number 2 is the tract of the afferent neuron, which carries the impulse from the sensory organ, let's say the eye, back to the spinal cord. And so this is these are always done by a particular type of neuron called an afferent neuron. The efferent neuron, or neurons that transmit signals back from the central nervous system to the effector organ. And here we see that number 4 is the efferent neuron, and the effector organ here is a muscle, number 5. Number 3 in the diagram is something called an interneuron, or internuncleal neuron. And they just communicate between sensory and motor neurons. And this diagram is actually designed to show what's called a reflex pathway, because it excludes the brain itself. The neurons can also be separated into whether they innervate muscles or do they innervate glands and organs. Those that innervate muscles are called the somatic motor nervous system. These are peripheral nervous system neurons that transmit their efferent action potentials from the central nervous system or the spinal cord to skeletal muscles, and they're shown here on the left. On the right, we see the autonomic nervous system. These are peripheral neurons that transmit their action potentials from the central nervous system to the smooth muscles of the GI tract, the heart, and also the glands. And these are shown on the right. On the left is the motor neurons. On the right is the autonomic system. And then the last division that I'll talk about is the difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. The sympathetic division of the nervous system, it's actually a division of the autonomic nervous system, prepares the body for an increased energy expenditure. It's what's also been called in the past the fight or flight nervous system. And you can see here on the right, the pupils dilate, the heart begins to beat faster, there's a relaxation in the lung bronchi that allows for the intake of more air. Because you're using your blood to run and to fight, blood is inhibited from going to the digestive system, so the digestive system shuts down. The liver is stimulated to produce more glucose, and the bladder relaxes in order to be able to hold more. Many times the rectum will contract, and if people are really scared, they can actually accidentally lose their bowels. The other side is known as the parasympathetic system, and this is a division that prepares the body for resting and for intake and nutrition. And the pupils constrict. There's a stimulation of salivation, which clearly is necessary for eating. The heart slows down because you really don't need as much heart activity. The bronchi constrict. And everything is shunted toward the GI tract in order to allow for increased digestion and ability to digest food. The liver gallbladder contracts, which is also part of the digestive system. The rectum relaxes to take in more, and the bladder also contracts. Now, I'm going to go over the anatomy of the nerve cell, and I'm first going to sort of do a general view of the cell, and then we'll break down and talk about the same parts with definitions of what those parts do. So first of all, you see this arrow points to what is called a dendrite. This arrow is pointing at the cell body. This arrow is pointing at the cell nucleus. This is the top of another part of the cell, and it's called the axon hillock. The axon hillock is part of the entire axon, which leads from the cell body out along this entire passage. This little gap or space between these sections of the axon is called a node of Ranvier. And a node of Ranvier is between each of these sections, and these sections are sections of myelin called the myelin sheath. And we'll talk about, as I said, all of these different parts and what they do in the next few slides. And then lastly, the end of the neuron on this side is called the presynaptic terminal. So now let's look at another neuron with some definitions. So first of all, we said that there was a cell body. The cell body houses the nucleus and the main organelles of the cell. And again, this is the cell body. The axon is responsible for sending action potentials away from, and the key word there is away from the cell body. And this is part of the axon. But the axon extends from the cell body all the way to the presynaptic terminal. So I'm just pointing at one part of the axon. The dendrites, on the other hand, bring action potentials to the cell body. And this is just one of many dendrites on this cell. This picture is a picture of one nerve cell. Let's use another picture of another nerve cell to talk about some more parts of the nerve cells. The axon hillock, you remember that I pointed that out a couple of slides ago. This is the site where an action potential for this neuron would begin. And again, you remember it's right there. The myelin sheath is wrapped around the axon. It's a fatty wrapping. It comes from a cell called a Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system, and the Schwann cell itself actually wraps itself around the axon. And The purpose of the myelin is to speed conduction, and we'll talk about how that happens in just a minute. And there's the red here is the myelin sheath with the axon inside the myelin sheath. And think of it literally as the insulation around a wire. The Schwann cell is the cell that produces the myelin sheath, and there's no, I'll have no arrow for that since it would be the same as the myelin sheath arrow. Now here's another diagram, and this shows more than one neuron body, and there's also a branching point there in the middle. The node of Ranvier, remember, is the gap in the myelin. And these points or gaps in the myelin are where the action potentials actually continue the conduction. And I'll, again, in a few slides, I'll show you how that happens. And here's just one example of a node of Ranvier. And you'll notice that each Schwann cell has a nucleus. And so each section of the myelin represents one Schwann cell that's wrapped itself around the axon. And then in between each Schwann cell are these gaps known as nodes of Ranvier. The presynaptic terminal, also called the terminal button or the axon terminal, these are the branching ends of the axon. And here's an example of one. There's several in the picture here actually. And this is where the conduction continues from one neuron to another or from a neuron to a muscle cell. Collateral neurons, and in this picture there's actually a split in the neurons, and that's a collateral neuron, and I didn't draw an arrow for that on this diagram. Now cells can come in various forms, and there are actually three different kinds of neurons in the nervous system. On the left here we have what's called a unipolar neuron. And a unipolar neuron has one process and one cell body. And you can see the process branches out in two directions once it comes out of the cell, but there's only one cell process out of the cell body itself. And that process is the axon. And the conduction can occur either direction from that axon. Remember that these are always afferent, seen in afferent nerves. And remember, afferent nerves are neurons that bring impulses from sensory receptors into the central nervous system or into the spinal cord. In the middle, we have what's called a bipolar neuron, and it has two processes. And one of those processes is an axon, and one of those processes is a dendrite. The axon, the impulses lead out of the cell from the axon and into the cell from the dendrite. These are also afferent cell neurons. And the third one is on the right here is the one that is most commonly pictured, and it's called a multipolar. And it has many processes. You can see there's several dendrites, generally one axon. And these are commonly motor neurons, and also something called association neurons. Association neurons are neurons that transmit impulses from one neuron to another neuron.